Hello, and welcome back to We're Not So Different, a podcast about how we've always been idiots. My name is Luke Waters, and I'm an amateur historian. And as always, I'm joined by Dr. Eleanor Yaniga, who is anything but. Hey, y'all. Today we got an interview, so we got no question, but, as always, subscribe to the Patreon. It is a lot of fun, $5 a month,
Mm.
patreon.com/WNSD pod. You get these episodes ad free, bonus episodes, all that sort of shit.
Hmm.
And yeah, it'll be fun for all. The
We love and respect you more.
Yes, the name of the rose won the poll, and so we will be doing that as our next book club series. Yeah, so that'll be cool, and we've got another episode coming out depending on whether I upload this afternoon or tomorrow morning. It's either coming out tomorrow or the same day. Regardless, yep. Check it out. It'll be fun. It's about an insane guy on Twitter. Not the owner, just another random insane
Just
person.
another guy. We found
Just
a guy.
another. We found a guy. We keep thinking we found all there are, but there's more guys. Always more guys. Always more types of them. Anyway, yeah, let's get on to the show. So today, we're finishing up the series on proto-nationalism in the Middle Ages and modern nationalism, the one we've been doing intermittently since the beginning of the new year, after Eleanor was part of a panel on the subject at the American Historical Association conference. In our mailbag episode, we did say we'd be starting a new series on weird medieval stuff this time, but we had one more interview for this and decided to do it now instead of waiting and breaking up the new series. We're sure you'll understand. You'll no doubt recall that while nationalism as we know it wasn't a thing in the Middle Ages, it certainly had its roots in the era, and half-truths or outright fabrications about that time fueled modern nationalist fantasies. We discussed the materialist reasons and causes for this, including the lack of fixed borders and fluidity of dynastic rulership in the Middle Ages. Then there's early Christian nationalism, half-truths, and those half-truths and outright fabrications in modern historiography about the medieval era, return of the V ideas, and more. But this time, we're talking about tradwives, or as less terminally online people might know them, people who want to go back to being traditional Catholics, whatever that nebulous term actually means. So we're going to look at why people do this, why women, a lot of women. I mean, it's obviously not all women, but a lot of women seem to be doing this cottage core thing, coquette waif
So much.
thing, whatever on on TikTok and on various social media platforms, whether they're actually longing for the past or just grifting, and how hyperconnectivity of the modern world is warping traditional religious hierarchies. And to do so, we've got an excellent guest. Dr. Lauren Horn Griffin is a professor of religious studies, nationalism, technology, and politics at Louisiana State University, otherwise known as LSU, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, here in the United States. Lauren has written extensively on shifting religious beliefs in the modern world, AI, and much more, and is the author of the forthcoming book, Discourses of Crisis and the Study of Religion. Dr. Lauren, how the hell are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, yeah, thank you for coming on the show. Yeah, I speak as someone else who is in the American South, saying pray for us because it's getting real humid already, and the bugs are already out, and it's barely even March. So yeah, I'm gonna let Eleanor handle most of the questions, but I did want to say that I'm very excited for this because the breakdown of the homogeneity of religious thought and the concept of orthodoxy in the modern world is something I've been thinking a lot about lately. So yeah.
Yeah. I'm so excited, Lauren, to pick your brain because slight fangirl, everybody. Go read Lauren's work. It's absolutely excellent. And I developed an academic crush on her immediately after hearing her speak. So, that this could be you, you know. That's all I'm saying. But I think a great place to kind of start everybody off for this. And one of the reasons in particular I wanted to talk to you is because of the work that you've been doing around women in these kind of nationalist movements in the trad cat movement. And I find them fascinating because of the sort of cognitive dissonance of fighting to put in place a system that you will necessitarily it necessitates you being a lesser, right? So this isn't new, of course. We see women do this over and over again within, the quote unquote Western historiography, right? I think in particular of the anti-suffragette movement, which is like, where they outnumbered the suffragettes by volumes, two or three times way more women who are like, no, I am not a person. Don't let me vote. Um, Even within a medieval context, we see this come up a lot where, they're probably playing the system a little bit. But for example, if things get a little bit too hot, you'll see Eleanor of Aquitaine go to the Pope and be like, oh, I'm just a woman. Oh, I don't know what I'm doing. These kind of things. Like I couldn't possibly look after myself. But I suppose that in a 21st century context, it just seems even stranger because we are a part of a social context that has allowed women to be seen more like equals. I wouldn't say that we're seen as equals, but more like equals. And there are more and more people who do kind of think that. I don't think our systems have quite caught up with that all the way, but it is interesting to watch these women fight for this. And I wonder if you could just start us off talking about how fucking weird that is, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, I like how you highlighted the weirdness and the strangeness, because I would say the one unifying theme in all of this is that the strangeness is the point, right? The point is to be countercultural, like a pious, righteous cowboy, a rebel, right? They're
Mhm.
rebels. So there seems to be an assumption, and it's a common sense assumption, but especially in progressive circles, that transgression necessarily correlates to liberation or liberative movements.
Hmm.
But I think this type of trad content can lead us to maybe a more nuanced way of theorizing the relationship between transgression or counterculturality and then modalities of power, right? There
Hmm.
is still power in this type of transgression, even though it looks weird, strange, moving backward, right? Being countercultural, there's power in that, right? And that's where people are finding that's why people are finding this so useful. They can construct an idea of a rebel, a cowboy, the few, the proud, right? A special group that knows the truth, like this kind of idea. Also, the women who are kind of creating in this content today, they're doing it with a safety net and they know it, right? So even though being a tradwife with no prenup can absolutely financially trap and ruin you, even today, we have things like no contest divorce, the ability to get a credit card, the shelters and programs for those experiencing domestic violence. And even though, like you said, even though these systems are far from perfect, we just have so much more in terms of a safety net that existed, that didn't exist 50, 60, 70 years ago, right? You can safely escape if you change your mind. And mainstream society, as you said, will absolutely understand and support you because the dominant theme is gender equality, right? That's a pretty mainstream idea, even if we don't execute it perfectly all the time. So in many ways, the stakes are kind of fake, right? We can't ever go back to the 1950s or the 1630s or the 1350s or whenever we imagine a golden age. And we all know this, we're all sort of in on it, in on the work, right?
Hmm.
So the social structures in which trad content operates can never be that. And hence, right, how they're performing and often monetizing this lifestyle on TikTok.
It's a really good point. I think it's so interesting to watch them do this countercultural thing and think of it in that context because I suppose that whenever I hear the term countercultural, the first thing I think of is like hippies, right?
Hippies, yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And now don't get me wrong, I think some hippies are getting in on this.
Mm-hmm.
I made the mistake of saying to one of my girlfriends who's obsessed with this kind of content that we were interviewing you, and she just started sending me Instagram video after Instagram video of all of these women just being bonkers, right? And it's you know what? It makes for great watching.
Yeah.
But and I do kind of like wonder about the seriousness of it because I think that you're really right here, right? It's there is this kind of wink wink nudge nudge thing here where it's like, Well, yeah, okay. I'm saying, oh, I'm definitely lesser than my husband, but if stuff gets too weird, I could also leave, right? Like
Yes,
that would certainly be the case, right?
absolutely.
Okay, so I suppose the next thing to kind of bring up here is, you know, a lot of the time when we are talking about like, nationalism or these discourses more specifically, and within, a Catholic context, we it's really easy to say that this is kind of like a masculine thing. And, there are lots of reasons for this, right? We see all these studies now, for example, that talk about how, and I wonder what you think about this. They'll talk about how men are becoming more conservative than women. And I don't think that's true. I think that actually what's happening is that women are more radicalized in a leftist way than men are, and men are kind of staying the same. So that's sort of the thing that I think. And so it's making men look more conservative than they actually are in a way. But we tend to kind of talk about these things in terms of masculinity. So, people will bring up, for example, incels. People will bring up, all of these kind of orthodox kind of pretenders in whatever religion, whether it's, Judaism or Catholicism, we see a lot of it. But there is, of course, involved in this huge undercurrent of women who are involved, right? So when we look at this, are there major players in this area, or is it more kind of amorphous? Like it's a kind of I don't know, whoever can get on TikTok first kind of vibe.
Yeah, I mean, the world of like what we've now kind of dubbed tradwife or trad girl content is vast and diverse, and it ranges really from. I mean, there are like a kind of more left-wingy style accounts that really avoid trying to take over political stances, and then there are of course very reactionary accounts. I mean, it is sometimes they're specifically trad Catholics, and sometimes they're not. Mormon influencers are obviously dominated
Mm,
the mommy blogosphere, and then that moved into Instagram. So it really is, and some of it is like mom content, and then some of it is, as Luke was saying, there's like a whole like wafy kind of like girls who rot in like their white nightgowns, kind of all monastic. They invoke a lot of monastic imagery vibes. So that's more
mm.
like a single girl, kind of a little bit the other side of the coin to incels, but just certainly less aggressive. But sort of idolizing this idea of like a Julian of Norwich, or like just like this idea of like an old hermit, mystical hermit lady or something.
Mm,
So like there's again a huge wide variety of the ways in which people invoke the Middle Ages specifically, but the past more generally,
mhm.
or to construct ideas of tradition that do a bunch of different stuff. So it's really hard to talk about this as a movement
Yeah.
or a singular thing, right? So there are pitfalls to talking about them like that. But to talk about specific accounts, I mean, probably the most famous one, whenever you're going to read an article or anything about trad content, Ballerina Farm is a
Oh
very
God, yeah.
famous account of, and she's got, a farm. It's nostalgic, pastoral, linens, carrying eggs in an apron. It's very pastoral.
Mhm.
And her account avoids overt discussion of politics, though, of course, her particular performance of motherhood and womanhood stands hand in glove with the production of whiteness.
Right.
So we can see her sort of operating in that tension that LDS and other communities create around womanhood. And then you have others like SD Williams, who are more explicitly reactionary. She didn't grow up in a traditionalist community, so she's sort of like finding this as a remedy for
Ah.
contemporary ails. So her account, Williams' account in particular, performs an explicitly almost cosplay like 1950s housewife, like Marilyn Monroe, like blonde hairstyle, very 1950s A-line dresses. But I think that very few, if any, of these bigger stars would call themselves white nationalists or even associate
Mhm.
explicitly with far right politics, right? Many of them have to continuously denounce their association. So
Right.
there are, of course, smaller influencers and online spaces where that stuff is talked about more explicitly. But I think in large part, the performance of womanhood and whiteness is more subtle, and misogyny and racism often go hand in hand. So while they're not exactly figures like tradcats like Nick Fuentes, who is the leader of a group
Mm.
called America First, that is explicitly white nationalist, explicitly anti-Semitic. Um, I think that on the other hand, this sort of TikTok and Instagram trad wife type content serves as rich texts that do a lot of different social work that often overlaps with those themes of whiteness and misogyny, but certainly in maybe less explicit ways than an obvious candidate like Nick Fuentes.
Mm, mm. So, just to go a little off piece here, a bunch of like the specifically trad cath girls that I've seen when I'm kind of looking into this, a lot of the time they're like either affianced or single or like very newly married, which
Mhm.
I've noticed. And they'll be, saying like, oh, here's how I, put my headscarf on for church. That's a big one. I've seen one where there's this girl who she was in a nunnery but left the nunnery and now she's affianced and she like makes her own scapulars and she's kind of like hawking these DIY scapulars that she makes. But when I tend to see like the more expressly Catholic ones, a lot of the time they're like earlier on, I suppose,
Mhm.
in the pipeline, as it were. Whereas when I tend to see, for example, LDS women, it's like, and here's like my 5 children who are named impossible things.
Yeah.
They're always named like Stalin or like something weird
Yeah.
like, and I wonder what you make of that.
Yeah, I think so yeah, lots of theories. I think because Mormon women dominated the mommy blogs of Web 1, right? Like an
Mm,
earlier
mm,
internet era, that sort of bled into this Web 2 social media dominated. So when they dominated the blogosphere, so they had content ready and like kind of examples from their community ready
right.
to go. And some of them are like I follow these Baylor twins. I don't know why I'm so interested in them. I wouldn't call them trads like explicitly, but like they're definitely LDS, very, they're
Mm,
both married. They married real early, like ring by spring style. But they
Mm.
like their mom was a mommy blogger, and like they're the kids that now are married and have TikTok accounts of their like house now. So like I think they sort of inherited influencing in some ways the LDS community.
mm,
Whereas Catholicism being a vibe now, just like Baroque imagery, like sort of a
mm,
reaction to the 90s style Christianity, the guitars and the sort of contemporary Christian music. And so now megachurch stuff, that being kind of seen as cheesy and produced, whereas Catholicism is old and haunting and
mm,
rich. And so, like, it's sort of a reaction to that sort of mainstream culture. Again, we're counterculture, right?
right. Right.
We're rejecting the cool stuff to go to like the real, right? So it's about this
Hmm.
construction of tradition, of authenticity, and how like discourses and images of Catholicism is used to produce that. I think is newer and really a product of a Web 2 era, much
Mm,
more than the previous LDS blogosphere.
that makes sense. Yeah. I guess it is I find it so interesting like as a person who was raised in a Catholic context, I just find it so funny. It's like I just like because a lot of them just seem either like they're new Catholics or like it doesn't seem authentic. And I guess that it is that kind of like it's like do you know what it's really like is that whole dark academia thing
Mhm.
where people
Yes,
are like, they're like, I'm in front of a bookcase, and and it's like, honey, that is not what uni's like, but like, okay,
sure.
get it. But I find the two things to be like really quite similar, where I think everyone just kind of wants to run off to. I can see the appeal of wanting to run off and live in a monastery. Like, I get that, but it's like, I mean,
Yeah.
girl, you're in Fresno,
Yeah.
kind of deal, which I don't.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly a lot of similar aesthetics with like dark academia or this sort of like, and there's this idea that it's more intellectual and it's like, and it's
Mhm.
older and richer. And but yeah, a lot of the creators are indeed converts. A lot of people who would consider themselves trads. It is like I mean, they're all over the place, but it's a lot dominated by young people and converts.
Mhm. Okay, so how do the women within these particular spheres, you know, position themselves, right? Because there's this sort of circle of if you're going to be prominent in a place that is also saying that you have to be subservient, how do you square that circle, right? It's like, how do you put yourself out in front of the world? And I mean, let's be honest, this is a type of thirst trap. Even when it's
Mm.
like a modesty thirst trap, it's like, it's like saying, look how cute I look in the headscarf I'm putting on for mass. Look at the eggs in my basket. Look at my Marilyn Monroe get up, right? It's like, how do you balance those two things? Because I find it quite tricky and a really obvious, obviously I'm on the outside, but this is an obvious pitfall, right? I'm like, girl, you can't be introducing this as sexy and saying, oh, but like, don't find me sexy, and saying, oh, I'm prominent, but don't find me prominent, you know?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's really complex, right? So I think like when people are told to exist only in like a walled environment, right? Preferably filled with children. And here social media comes along, and now there's a camera, a window into the larger world from which you've sort of been disenfranchised. So it's both old and new, right? It's new because the internet, specifically this like Web 2, almost Web 3 moment, this always on hyperconnectivity is new, right? So
Mhm.
there is no tradwife without the internet, right?
Yeah.
This particular phenomenon. But on the other hand, like you said, conservative women have long done this thing of speaking out about not speaking out, or
Yes. Yeah.
yeah, or being prominent about not being prominent. Yeah, so we can think of, obviously, like you said, anti-feminist activists like Phyllis Schlafly in the
Yeah.
1970s, even the anti-suffragette
Ugh.
activists that you mentioned, right, from the 20th century, early 20th century. I think but I think I think what like is really hard to escape, at least, especially, I mean, in my brain too. But I think when we frame this dynamic only as hypocrisy, only as a contradiction, I think
Mm.
we take too rationalist a view of what's going on.
Mhm.
This is something that the field of religious studies critiques really well. When we rely on rationalist assumptions of religion, that is, this idea that belief motivates actions, and a sort of enlightenment idea that people are just rational individuals making choices. What religious studies does is say, rather than assume that beliefs motivate actions, we can instead sort of view the actions of individuals and groups as continuous acts of identity formation, which are not stable or internally coherent, right?
Mm.
So it's not just that they're contradictory hypocrites, right? Speaking out about not speaking, but they're participating in complex social formations that evolve ideas, but also affect and emotion and aesthetic, and they're doing it in a world of algorithms and constant mediatization and performance and an overabundance of choice.
Mm.
So rather than view this as a reaction of these people to modernity, I think we can see it as a thoroughly modern, even sort of postmodern product, and a move past sort of a liberal self, like
Mm.
a way of thinking about oneself like that. I think that it's a really actually kind of a complex rethinking of identities.
See, that's so interesting because I think you're bang on there. Like it is a bit postmodern, right? Where it's just sort of like, well, you can pick and choose and things have the meaning that you ascribe to them. But it's so funny to think about traditionalism in this kind of postmodern way. In a lot of ways, it seems to me it's almost like the inverse of my own work, right? Where I'm kind of like looking for, identities or callbacks or ways that we can see our society in the past, right? And how we can kind of like find connections through, right? Like, right, the name of the podcast is We're Not So Different. Like, so here's these things that connect us. But it's sort of like doing the opposite thing. It's like they're like our Wario. They're like
Yeah, yeah.
we're in the
It
present, and I'm going to make myself into the past in order to do this.
well, I mean, I think as like the walls between different religious groups blur even further in, the modern or postmodern era or whatever we're in. I think like once that starts to happen and people start to see this, like spirituality becomes like this incredibly, incredibly personalized thing. And like, it's even more than it ever has been about like, whatever you see as the trappings of this thing in your mind,
Mm.
that's what it is. Now, like, they might never go to mass, they might never go to they might not be that serious about it, but like it's this like spiritual trapping, this thing where it's, like it's like a personal, like religious belief. But at the same time, like a lot of these things are breaking down. American Catholicism and Catholicism in other parts of the world as well seems to be like moving a lot more towards evangelicalism, where it's like very concerned with like culture, with like culture war stuff, and like especially reactionary culture war stuff. And that has, at least not in typical thought, been like the province of the general Catholic Church for a while, and doesn't seem to be the way the Pope kind of wants, the direction the Pope wants to go in right now. But like as these things kind of break down, people just, I think they just kind of start picking and choosing, and they're like, well, and some of them do the thing where they're like, well, I want more traditional. So I'm going cottage core, I'm going
Mm.
tradcath, I'm going to an Orthodox church or something like that. And then some of them are just like, I'll just kind of pick whatever I want and do this and like adopt this aesthetic thing, on TikTok. And whether they seriously believe it or not, you know, who's to say, you can't really know that about anyone, but it is what it is at that point. That seems to be something that is affecting a lot of it, and why a lot of this stuff is melding together so rapidly. Like religion, the boundaries between religious sects are like falling away, even if they still ostensibly hate each other, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about like the relative, the with new boundaries and new affinity, like with new affinities comes new boundaries, right? And so
Hmm.
we think back to like the mid 20th century and like JFK sort of having to, still being looked at really
Yeah,
askance for being
yeah.
Catholic, and Catholics are still maybe first or second generation immigrant families at this point. So economic stuff plays a role, but as time passed, right, and as again, we can talk about like the construction of whiteness, right, as
Mm.
Italians and Irish became more legibly white,
Hmm.
like it changed. Um, Now Catholics aren't looked at that askance. Joe Biden's Catholicism was not a barrier, and like that was very
Mm.
little discussed in his election. Like, so it's white Catholics voted for him about 50-50. So like it wasn't a major player. So yeah, like the ways in which discourses on religion and tradition are often already discourses on race and gender are
Hmm.
interesting and not always brought out to the fore. So yeah, I mean, the performances of all that stuff changed as time moved and as the demographic of the Catholic Church changed as well, the US specifically. So that made, like you said, culture war stuff. They sort of joined with evangelicals in common cause in a way that they couldn't do 50, 60, 70 years ago.
Hmm.
Um,
Because
so yeah.
50 years ago, people like my grandparents on one side of my family would have referred to any Catholic in their midst as like a filthy demon papist. I'm not like
Mhm.
actual things they would have called them that I heard in my lifetime, so it's like, like that's how it was. And I mean, there are still people like that out there. There are still evangelicals like that out there, to be clear, but like,
Mm.
when I was a kid, like, it was like, eh, you know, you could hear Southern, older Southern people just like spit on the ground anytime Kennedy's name is mentioned. Like it's just like,
Ah.
they're demon dogs, but that's
Mhm.
not really as much of a thing anymore, because a lot of them have kind of figured out that even if they don't totally agree on this, hey, they're, pushing in the same direction and all that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, now the US is more racially and religiously diverse. And so,
Hmm.
yeah, new affinities have been made between Christians of all sorts vis-a-vis others. So, yeah.
Okay,
True.
Lauren, this has brought up a question for me because of something Luke mentioned very briefly. Do we see like orthodox, like trad orthodox girls? Because I'm wondering if like orthodox is almost still more racialized in a way, like quote unquote, because when people will say that they're orthodox, it's like they're Russian Orthodox or they're Greek Orthodox, and it does have these Eastern connotations. And is that like seen as a step too far, or can you be, an influencer girl who's like going Greek, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, no, so the Orthodox communities certainly have these influencers as well. They're definitely right there. And there is a sense in which sometimes traditionalist Catholics, especially converts, when they find that the Roman rite, right, the Latin Mass doesn't go traditional enough, sometimes they'll go to Eastern Catholicism, so the
Hmm.
Eastern rite, which is a more gold and seen as older or fully Orthodox. So they'll go further east.
I love it.
It's again, it's that search for origins, the search for pure, original, authentic stuff, right? And people, yeah. So there's definitely a pipeline of like, so trad, I got Orthodox for sure. But like you said, there's definitely right, the more ethnic connections there. But yeah, that certainly happens.
I kind of love and respect that, unfortunately. But it's like it's just very interesting to me. Like one of my best friends is Greek Orthodox, and it's very fun because like she does like all the dancing and everything. So and I'm like, I get it, as a like a very like it's cool because you get all these cool hobbies on top of it too, and I mean also icons, which I really think are boss.
Are
So
pretty, yeah.
yeah, they're cool. I mean,
I
and this is the thing, like, they kind of got my ass on some of these things. I'm like, to be fair, like that's very beautiful. And like, and and one of the things that I always say, like not as a Catholic myself, but I can understand going into, like when I'm dicking around in cathedrals, as is my want over here in Europe, I'm like, it is moving, right? It is beautiful. Like, I mean, but I kind of go in and I think about the connection through time to all these wonderful people and the beautiful things that humans can make, and I'm like, wow, it's really incredible, and but I can understand that as a religious stance. Like, I get it. I mean, and that's the trouble, is that what makes this so insidious, right, is that you look at these things and you're like, yeah, it would be nice to have your own chickens. Fuck,
Yes.
like, right,
Yes.
like, I get it.
Yeah, I constantly joke about like if I like get denied tenure, I'm just gonna get some chickens, start a little garden. Like, yeah,
Yeah, for
like, there is
sure.
like a sense of like this even even if you're doing it, this idea of going back to the land or something, like working outside with your hands. I mean, it definitely it's appealing, and they've nailed the aesthetics in every way, from the pastoral stuff to like the Baroque architecture, like icons, like it's all pretty. There's no doubt about it.
let me ask a question here. We talked to other guests in this series about how religion, in a lot of ways now, is kind of used by people to establish like a community for themselves, like a group affinity for themselves. So I mean, like, we've kind of talked about maybe there are some fundamentalist true believers, maybe there's a bunch of grifters involved, but like, do you see an aspect where like people are like, okay, look, like, uh, maybe this is all bullshit. I don't know, but I think I can at least like get some friends out of this. I'm not saying that makes it better or anything, but I do understand the compulsion to try and find a community like that in the modern day.
Yeah, I think, yeah, policing sincerity is hard, and I think that
Yeah,
sometimes
yeah,
people
yeah.
don't even
And
know
I'm not asking you to do that. I
oh,
realize now,
totally.
thinking about it, that that's like a really impossible question, but like,
No. I think that like even our own sincerity, like we don't always know why we do things or why we're
hmm
drawn to
hmm
certain things, right? Like, and I think that because of like, I really think that another thing that comes really hard into play in my work is thinking about how algorithmic culture shapes a lot of this. Because the connections that the algorithms make sometimes are really interesting, right? So like
hmm
as I like homesteading content, now I'm getting a Latin mass. Like what? Like, so it's one of those things that like it also is a player in this, right? So there's humans involved that have like certain attractions to certain aesthetics, but then there's also the algorithm. And so the sincerity to like, I think that the idea of like these I was just talking to a young woman the other day who was really drawn to like the monastic life, and belief had no part in it. She just really liked the idea of living in a group of women and laying, like having time to breathe and like languishing almost, right?
hmm
And so this idea that like, but she in no way saw this as like hypocritical or insincere, right? So like, I think the line between quote true, like this idea of belief as a cognitive assent to a set of propositions, I think just
hmm
going down that road will always lead to questions that I'm not particularly interested in. I'm interested in this
hmm
broader idea of identity formation.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so I want to skip to a bit now that you've mentioned the algorithm, because one of the things that I'm super interested in is like the tools that these women are using in order to disseminate the messages that they're kind of working on, right? Because you do need to understand algorithms, right? You do need to understand how to connect these things. And there's this delicious tension, I think, between, being so trad and being like, how do I game the algorithm in order to show you my how I tie my trad calf headscarf, right? And so and it's quite savvy in a way.
Mhm.
So yeah, like how are they kind of using these tools to their advantage, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean the most basic one, tagging, that can help. So hashtagging, but like using popular sounds or stitching. So this is how like discourses get layered and layered, right? So we stitch this, and it's stitched from a very popular original video, so they kind of can piggyback on the back of that. There was a really dominant a couple of weeks ago. There was this a woman who was talking about someone was complaining that millennials aren't having enough kids, and so a woman stitched that and was like, here's why millennials aren't having kids. Like the cost is unbearable, right? Like
Yeah.
it's not possible for a lot of people. And then this young woman, her name was Emma, poor Emma. I feel she's like 20. And so she was like, I'm a daughter, and my parents have 10 kids. And she was clearly, she never said Catholic in her post, but like her house is very trad Catholic, like,
Mm.
rosaries, nuns, all that kind of pictures of nuns, stuff like that. And so she was saying how it is possible if you just work really hard and
Oh,
you
God
just
bless her.
sacrifice a little. And that went super duper viral, got tons and tons of stitches, both from trads as well as people who were like, oh, I'm a girl, no. So
Mm.
so that, and then that like kind of led to a side discussion about traditionalist Catholicism, because people were like, yo, she's trad, like she doesn't know any better, kind of as sometimes as an
Mhm.
excuse, but sometimes as a motivator. So the ways in which people were trying to explain the complex sets of things that made Emma come to the conclusions she came to. Some people are trying to blame her Catholicism. Some people are trying to blame, trad influencers, or her parents or whatever it was. But that was like a really nice case study in like the rich, like ways that like how we came to be the way we are, and how the algorithm blowing her up and starting all of these side discourses, like that's just how this all works, right? And
Mm.
it was just really a really interesting little moment to
Oh,
watch.
God bless her. I mean, like I would say, I'm gonna add to the discourse now, and I think that it's because she's 20.
Yeah.
I'm just
It's not,
like, oh, sweetheart, oh, darling,
I
like, oh,
know.
God
Yeah.
bless.
I'm so glad I did not have any of this when I was like in my teens. Oh, the things I
Oh
would have
God.
said. I can't even.
Yeah, I'm really glad that there's no digital footprint of me.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, come on, elder millennial. Like,
Burning down servers, entire server farms, just like killing
yeah,
the
just
Library of Alexandria 30 times just to make sure nobody sees like the like whiny bullshit I wrote about like Linkin Park songs when I was 15. And
Yeah.
like, no,
absolutely.
no.
No, no, like
Yeah.
that's what we must return to with a V is, not like having a permanent digital record of the stupidest thing you ever said. I'll say that. But
Yeah.
okay. So like God bless Emma. I guess
Mhm.
the next thing that I kind of want to ask about is so, I've been delving deep, not as deep as you do, into this beforehand. And there's this chick I'm obsessed with now, and this is again my mate Sarah's fault. Um, so she's an influencer, and her whole thing is like, well, she's obviously trying to sell stuff, but she's constantly talking about how to be a Christian at the gym. This is her thing. So she goes to the gym, and she's selling these like Christian branded clothes, and they're all like pink and like violet. And she's all like, bring your Bible. And, and she's got like, it'll show her doing squats, but there's like a crucifix on the back of her gym gear. And then she'll be like, speak in tongues. And I'm like, bitch, are you really speaking in tongues at the gym? And she'll like show herself speaking in tongues. And I find this baffling, but also I cannot look away. It is a car crash and I love it. But I suppose that like I'm used to one of the things that's going to happen within these kind of like trads, right? When they're doing traditional feminine things, it's like that's gonna be like family, it's gonna be home life. But there's also these weird new discourses you can put forward, which is like, okay, so a feminine thing is making sure you look the correct way, and here's how you square the circle by like going to the gym, right? And anyway, I'm obsessed with her. I can't stop now. Like,
Yeah, that's really great because you're right that like a lot of these things are dominated by older pastoral themes, and it's food is a huge part of it. So
mhm.
the fact that like but a modern gym being like connected but also like very different aesthetically and like theme wise is really really interesting because it's still about like the curation of your body and you should wear pink and purple and still be feminine,
Mm,
but instead of like spinning in a field, it's like at a modern like gym, which is
mhm.
really a really interesting juxtaposition. That's super interesting.
I'll send you a link to this chick because whoa. But it's like very clearly kind of like a strip mall gym,
Is
you
it
know?
is she again like is this just to like show off is this like showing off your gains in a Christ in a way that centers Christ, or is this one of those like women who wear yoga pants at the gym or like causing the downfall of Western society type things?
So she seems to be like showing off her gains for Christ because it's like the workout
Mm.
clothes are like workout clothes, right?
Oh,
So,
okay, okay, yeah.
like they are like they're not
Yeah.
particularly skimpy, but it's like,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
clothes that you
yeah.
would wear to work out. And I've also definitely seen kind of trad girls then playing off of stuff like that, being like, well, here's what I wear to the gym. And
Yeah.
here's the modest clothing that I wear to the gym. And I've definitely seen girls being like, well, I wear these baggy clothes. I
Yeah,
wear
yeah,
like just some
yeah.
sweatpants. Like, so they're obviously kind of also reacting to this. And obviously this chick in particular is kind of like more from the evangelical
Hmm.
side of things, right? So it's like it is like a go to the gym and speak in tongues, which
Mm.
again, I refuse to get over this. I will not get over speaking tongues in the
Look,
gym.
if she's normally lifting like, 115 and she starts speaking in tongues and all of a sudden she's deadlifting 240, like okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
Might
you
be
got
onto
me
something.
there. Like I don't know what to do with
Like maybe I
that.
would, but I mean,
Yeah.
this is the thing too. It's like, not to like, like look down at my fellow women at the gym, but it's like, I'm telling you, I'm deadlifting more than her. That's all. Okay. So like, what is Christ helping? I don't know.
I
Question
don't
mark.
know.
But it's so but I am really interested in like what discourses these women can kind of put forward. And so do we see more than just the traditional family, what you would expect, I guess, or like what else do we see within that?
Yeah, I really like that you brought up like the gym, like, because I think that the wellness health
Mm,
industry, however that pans out, right, that is really dominant in all of this stuff. So obviously, like we talked about homestead farming, growing your own food, but all of that has to do with like a lot of it is like escaping the problems with modern food production, pollution, unhealthy
mm,
stuff, right? Which is real, right? So there's been a lot of discourse on like the crunchy to right wing pipeline, and it does have to do with very real problems that often spin into conspiracy theories about food, the modern
mm.
healthcare system, healthcare industry, things like that. So I don't think a lot of these women set out to be the feminine face of white nationalism. Like I don't think that was their like
Yeah,
to
yeah.
create an account. But again, the complex ways in which discourses on tradition and naturalness
Mm,
overlap with the production of political identities, gender identities, class performance, ethnic identities, all
mm,
that should be discussed more because I do think it's a lot more. I think they get there through discourses of tradition and naturalness, right? What's
mm,
natural. And I think, and again, it may well just start out with like just like a bad experience with the contemporary healthcare system, or
right.
like wanting cleaner food, which is very understandable and
Yeah.
relatable. Um, and then all of these conversations get started, and then before you know it, like performing tradition means performing like
Mm,
full on, like I'm imagining myself as a medieval peasant, right? So
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
it gets really really interesting, but I do think that wellness and health, the way that those things dominate for everyone from like Oprah, to like to all this stuff like crunchy life and wanting
Mm,
to go
mm.
back to some sort of natural state. I think is like runs through all of these types of accounts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's quite an interesting one because, like, obviously living in Europe, one of the things that people ask me about all the time, being an American, is they'll be like, "Oh, do you know like anti-vaxxers or all these things?" And I'm like, "Well, baby, I'm from Seattle, so like everybody that I know
Ah,
who's anti-vaxxer, it's from the hippie side. It's like from the crunchy side. But I've definitely had, acquaintances and friends who start there. Like, they're just really into yoga, and then like you've lost them. Like they're
Hmm.
gone one day.
Mhm.
And they've just ended up over on the right as a result of like, these very real experiences. And I guess that so this brings me to like one of my big questions where it's like, do you think to a certain extent movements like this or desires like this are partially just kind of like part of a desire for a less complex life, right? So like one of the things that I can kind of see and understand from the standpoint of like this helpless femininity or like this, cottage core, I'm gathering eggs in a pretty dress sort of thing is this idea that perhaps like a benevolent kind of daddy husband is going to come and then he's going to take care of like all of the complex aspects of your life. And then all you have to do is clean the house and look after the children, which, like, by the way, cleaning the house and looking after the children, oh my God, nonstop, horrible, awful, like so much work, Jesus fucking Christ, right? But I do think that there is something in here that is about a desire to kind of disengage from the complexity of being an adult or the complexity of like where we've got to in our modern world.
Yes.
Because, as you say, like we have problems
Hmm.
with food. There are certainly problems with healthcare, especially in an American context, right? Like Jesus Christ. And this kind of desire, there's this kind of uncontested imaginary space about what tradition is, right? Where, you know, a lot of people don't know about what it's like to be a medieval peasant. Like they've got no idea because it's either people saying, "Oh, everyone was dying in a ditch and no one cared," and like life was cheap and everyone hated themselves and were eating gruel, or you've got them saying, "Well, actually, they worked less than you," and ba ba da ba da ba, without like kind of any
Yeah.
complexity on the matter. So it's easy to kind of dive into this space and say, "Oh, somewhere there's an answer." Right. And
Yeah.
I'm just wondering Lauren, expand on my thoughts, please.
Yeah, yeah. No, there is definitely explicit talk about the pitfalls of capitalism and corporatism and corporate culture in America and sort of this
Mm,
rejection of office life. So they'll say specifically, like you were saying, well, I would rather be like you say I'm beholden to my husband, but I'd rather be beholden to him than to some, corporate boss, like or to some
mm,
mid-level, manager or whatever. And this is appealing to a lot of people because they're like, yeah, I mean, are we ever free or in control of any of our own stuff? So why not just like let him go in there and I'll do this? Like, doesn't that sound better? So that I definitely
mm,
think even on across the political spectrum, the pitfalls of capitalism, are explicitly discussed. Corporatism, which again is super relatable and understandable, but because of
mm,
how identity formation works, those feelings and representations often get up, yeah, like you said, bound up with ideas of tradition that involve race and class and gender and imagining the past as less complex than it really was.
I mean, 'cause so like I'm thinking about my immigrant grandmother, very devout Catholic, right? Had six fucking kids. And I just don't look at, my sainted, Babichka Ludmila. Like we love her. Thank God for her. But Jesus Christ, that was not an easy life. I'm just like I look at everything that Grandma Lil had to go through, and I'm like, that is so much work. It's so
Mhm.
much work and it's so hard. And that was only like so my dad is the youngest of six and he was born in 55 and that's very much within living memory of him at the very least, and it was so tough and difficult and awful. And then I think I see these people kind of pining for, I don't know, the pioneer days. There's a
Mhm.
lot of I get served a lot of people in Alaska. I don't know if that's a function of the fact that my brother lives in Alaska, but I got served a lot of women when I started looking into this. A lot of women in Alaska who are about to give themselves botulism because they're canning potatoes with the skin on.
Mhm.
I'm also wondering why they're canning potatoes because they live in Alaska. I'm like, girl, dig a root cellar. Like
Yeah.
I don't know what you're doing right now. Why are you canning a potato? This is very confusing to me.
Yeah.
And I kind of also wonder, like, is there something happening, especially within that is like I think there's kind of like a post-apocalyptic thing
Oh yeah,
too.
this all overlaps with like survivalist content too. Yeah, for sure.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's like it is quite interesting because I'm like, there's something here about like a capitalist realism, right? Where it's like, so we've all come to realize that like capitalism is really not working out for like anyone except for like five guys right now.
Yeah.
And then their kind of thing is like, okay, so it's the end of the world.
Mhm.
That's what that means. So you got to be ready to like, get a bunch of potatoes and I don't know, like pray to God about it. And I'm like, you don't want to like make a better and more equitable world? And they're like, no, I got
Yeah,
it.
I think that's the other thing too, is that it would a lot of the all the content really delves down to that this idea of individual curation, right? Like, so rather than go out and like maybe start a movement or advocate for new, stuff, if you don't like corporate culture, rather than change it, it's up to you to work harder, or you to learn how to can, or you to learn how
Mhm.
to make your own sourdough, or for your kids so that they don't get all of the additives in our foods, right? It's your personal responsibility to learn all of these skills, right, and fix it, rather than so it's really, if we do really want to go back to the Middle Ages, what we're completely missing is any sort of semblance of community or communal aspects of life in any way. It's just personal curation and personal responsibility.
That's such a good point, right? Because I find that one of the things that people really reach for when they're talking about the medieval past is, this want for community and it's like, oh, and wouldn't it be nice to actually like get on with all your neighbors instead of hating them and like complaining about them on Nextdoor or whatever. But I don't see that happening as part of this. It's like I suppose that there's an argument to be made of like the curation of community online, which I have argued in the past and will continue to argue is a kind of like form of creating emotional communities, which we see happen in the Middle Ages. It's like rich folks are writing to other rich folks who live 400 miles away instead of like communing with the people who live out in the field. Like absolutely, that's something that's happening. But it's, I guess that it's interesting to see where the limitations of this desire for the past are and like where are the walls. And it's like, well, it is still so fiercely, I guess, postmodern because it is about the individual and this a personal identity instead of a communal identity, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Although I suppose that's what they're trying to do when they go to mass. I don't know. I don't understand them, but
Yeah.
it's not for me to understand, right? Like I don't want to be one of those people who gets drawn into the oh it's so hypocritical thing because it doesn't matter. You're never gonna get them. I get really bothered by people who are like, oh, haha, now this person, like, gotcha, you're being a hypocrite. I'm like, nobody care. They don't care, dude.
Right. That's exactly right. Right. Because it's not about that. Right. That's it. Back to our rationalist assumption. So yeah, what we can do though is say, hey, what a rich text this is for analyzing how identity formation works in an age of digital hyperconnectivity.
Ah, I absolutely love it. Lauren, I'm going to be thinking about this for weeks and writing you several emails. But for all of our wonderful listeners out there who want to think about this some more, where can they find more of your work?
Yeah, so for now, I'm still on Twitter, X, whatever, for now at least, but I'm also on Blue Sky at Lauren Horn Griff. My website is laurenhorngriffin.com, where you can find links to my book and my other publications.
Fantastic. Lauren, thank you so much for being here. This has just been a delight. And I'm sorry that I just yelled at you about a bunch of accounts I went and followed.
No, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah, Lauren, thank you very much for coming on. It was great to have you. Yeah, Eleanor, what do you have going on?
Yeah, as per usual, you can find me also like still kind of on X, Twitter, sort of. And on Blue Sky more often at Going Medieval. You can check out the blog, going-medieval.com. You can check out, of course, the book, The Once and Future Sex. Thank you very much. But otherwise, yeah, I don't know. Y'all, I'm around.
Yeah. You can find me all the usual places. Luke is amazing. You can find my old show, People's History of the Old Republic. It's about Star Wars. You might like it if you like Star Wars and like hearing me talk. Otherwise,
Mm.
probably won't like it very much. And yeah, I think actually the episode that me and Eleanor did with Masters of Our Domain,
Oh yeah, that should be
Milo and
out.
Phoebe I think it's out now. It's we did an episode about Seinfeld, the dealership, and yeah, it was a lot of fun. You should check that out if you want to hear us talk about Seinfeld.
Yeah,
Talk about another 90s show other than The Simpsons.
that's right.
Yep. All right. Well, yeah, thank you everyone so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye. Yay.